Hi guys, my name's Seb Tudor, I'm the man on the Silver Mountain and welcome back. Now this morning I had a couple of things to do and whilst I was at it I thought I'm going to sit down and watch the final episode of Star Trek Discovery because this is a creativity by committee video. This has been one of the most glaring examples that I've seen in a while and I wanted to bring it to you guys because firstly, ever since I was a little kid, I must have been like 5 or 6, probably at oldest, when my mum first sat me down in front of an episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation, and since then I've watched basically everything. Like there were, I think the last season of Enterprise was the one that I haven't seen, or like only seen bits of rather. So for the most part, I've watched everything, all the movies. I've got most of them on VHS and all that kind of thing. And as a result, it's something that I bought into, kind of like Star Wars, but I preferred Star Trek for the longest time. You know, they both have their place. I now realise that they're not really comparable because one is much more sci-fantasy, one is much more kind of space opera, science fiction. But it was a case of I much preferred the more grounded kind of idealism and kind of approach that Gene Roddenberry took and then kind of informed in the other shows after his death, with the various bits and pieces that he left behind and the other information that he had put out beforehand. And the further away we get from Gene Roddenberry and his death, the worse the shows have gotten. And I'm going to go through that in a minute, and then we'll focus on Star Trek Discovery specifically. But because I know I've seen people getting a bit wound up about spoilers for this stuff, even though it's like in my view, it's all been so formulaic and it's all been so poorly put together in the first place. The really and truly, you should be able to guess where it's going. There was one thing that I was uncertain of, and yeah, it amounted to the same. It just didn't matter. I had thought it would go one way, and it ended up going a different one. In fact, the way it went was worse, in my opinion. But we'll get into that in a minute. So, spoilers for all of you who care. For those of you that don't, good, stick around. And so let's get into it. So first off, you had the original series whereby Gene Roddenberry put initially in the pilot he had kind of Captain Christopher Pike with Leonard Nimoy as Spock and most of the rest of the crew that then showed up later on to one extent or another. But it was much, much lower budget. They weren't sure if it was going to take off. They didn't know if the pilot was going to do well and all the rest of it. It was very kind of up in the air. In which case, though, it did well enough and they got their show, which then brought Leonard Nimoy back and it brought William Shatner in as Captain Kirk, and it was an ensemble cast that was ideologically created. For example, it was height of the Cold War when the show was initially aired, and so and obviously you still had things like excessive racial tensions because equal rights between races and even equal rights between men and women were still kind of being negotiated, worked around, talked on, fought over. And so as a result, having a crew where you had a black woman as a senior officer, where you had a Russian man sat there with an American, and you had Sulu there as someone who also otherwise good chance wouldn't have been there, considering the various tensions. In spite of the fact that George Takei is essentially an American and has been for the longest time anyway, and so it's you've got this environment that was created whereby you had this interesting crew with lots of different things, and they tried to do the best they could. Obviously, special effects weren't there. William Shatner's overacting is legendary. And I argue that once he was given the option to tone it down and so on, especially in the films, he did, and it made it far more solid. But then obviously we got Leonard Nimoy, we got the character of Spock, who everybody loves and who stands out prominently in numerous different shows, including the new movies, the J.J. Abrams spin-off movies. So you've got this really significant and substantial universe that's been created. It's a good jumping off point, and it's built around the idea of the issues of the time: racism, sexism, political tensions, greed, and like monetary greed, material greed. Isn't completely gone, but has been minimalised by the way that society has grown and developed over time. And as a result of that, you've got this span of societies that they interact with, including the one that always springs to my mind when talking about this from the original series is you had the one, I can't remember the name of the alien species, but they were cut down the middle, and you had white on one side, black on the other, and then you had the reverse where it was black on one side and white on the other. I think I might have just done that the same, but you get what I'm saying. They were just flipped, and they were in the middle of a racial war against each other just because of who's, it was white left side versus white right side, and vice versa for black as well. And it was a case of we've got this racial war going on, and the interactions are seriously, but you're basically the same. We had racial problems on Earth for the longest time, but we overcame them, and now look at how awesome we are. That was happening before or as the arguments, fights, negotiations, and all those kind of things were happening around achieving equal rights and protections for everybody, and in legislation, in law. So that was groundbreaking. It stood out. The first interracial kiss ever on TV was Kirk with Uhura, and again, that stood out. They were doing all of these things well before their time. But they did it as a result of going, here's an ensemble cast, they've each got their own little thing, they're each going to go their own little way, we're going to showcase each one at times, mostly Kirk and Spock, but we're also going to showcase Bones, and we're going to showcase Scotty and Chekhov and Sulu and Uhura, and they're all going to have their part to play, and they're all going to have the episodes that occasionally will look at what they're doing. And they will all have their own scenes to show off that character. And so then, though, you move to take a look at the movies, for instance, and as said, it becomes a bit more, in certain instances, focused around an individual character. For instance, the one that springs to my mind is like a Search for Spock, where the whole goal of the entire movie is finding Spock. Yeah, he is literally at the core of the entire endeavour, and yet, arguably speaking, he's not actually in it as a character all that much. The rest of the crew, the rest of the characters are the ones that are actually engaging in the finding of him, in the dealing with that situation. He, in and of himself as a character, makes a few choice appearances, and then you've got the interesting conclusion which leads into the next movie. But again, all of this stuff was still from the same viewpoint of ideology of them going, well, yeah, the past is behind us and now we're moving forward. We are Starfleet, we're professional. We're, apart from Kirk, who's not professional, he thinks outside the box and gets laid a lot, but he still holds to those ideals. Yeah, he still holds to the equality and the peacemaking, the discovery and exploring. He's not just a warmonger, or looking for a fight, looking to go out there and find things to tackle for the sake of tackling them because he wants to conquer them. He's out there going and taking a look because it's fascinating. But then, big gap, huge gap, and Star Trek becomes this bigger and bigger thing. It's, recognised for a fair while, and then Gene Roddenberry is able to muster enough support for the next generation, which, was where I started watching. And you had this ensemble cast where everyone would get at least one episode to themselves, focusing on them per season. Characters would potentially come and go, or live and die, and be recycled in various ways. And then you would have the additional bits and pieces around just, yes, you've got the Federation, we're above greed, we're above kind of petty differences, we are a collection of individuals, not a collective. They are not collectivist at all. They are a group of individuals who have chosen to cooperate for a greater goal. You know, one of their greatest opponents, one of Jean-Luc Picard's greatest opponents throughout all of the shows and the movies that followed that featured the Next Generation cast, were the Borg, who are purely collectivist. You know, the you do have the two kind of sides of things where collectivism and individualism are kind of focused on, and then they're expanded upon, you know, and where they go right, where they go wrong, how problems are, and you've got the militant collectivism of the Borg literally being at odds with the incredibly individualistic but also very cooperative and collaborative Captain Jean-Luc Picard and his crew. But again, he's not the main character. None of them are the main character. They all have episodes that feature themselves, and they all have kind of throughout various seasons certain kind of episodes or like two-parters that do things that are outside of the norm. You know, time travel, mirror universes, weird alien stuff that has them realise how small they are in the universe that they're still exploring. And that then tests, very, very viciously tests some of those principles. You know, the Q continuum, for instance, in some of the very, very early episodes, is a direct expose on just how potent and prominent the principles are that the Federation, and just how professional the people are in the Federation, in Starfleet, that allows them to then essentially move beyond the judgment of this godlike super being. So then moving on to Deep Space Nine, which personally is one of my favourite shows. I know that a lot of people don't like it. Some of the religious mysticism stuff in there is a bit weird to me. I'll admit that, and it's not necessarily my favourite part of the show. But in regards to, you have this, again, ensemble cast where everyone has their own episodes focusing on them, everyone has their own stuff going on, and it's a living, breathing station in a tough situation. So you've still got conflict, but for instance, some of the conflict comes from episodes entirely revolved around the bartender and his brother, you know, Quark and Rom, just trying to stay out of trouble, or deliberately trying to get into trouble. Either way. But it's this living, breathing environment that shows off the, again, diplomatic and kind of day-to-day life as well within the Federation that you don't see as part of an exploratory ship all the time. And so I really got into that. I was like, this is great. It highlights some stuff. And then when you do have some of the mystic stuff or some of the espionage stuff, or when they actually just straight out go to war in the later seasons, like, you don't have kind of issues with various confrontations between groups. You see the Federation and Starfleet bring people together to not devalue their own individual identities or whatever else, but to allow them to move forward and to progress and develop. And this is stuff that they have been doing now, by that point, for a very long time. You know, this is something that is as solidly ingrained in the culture of the Federation and Starfleet, informed by, you know, several core species that have then allowed for this development over time into this ideologically and principally driven organization. And now this is the day-to-day, you know, and in a place where you don't have greed but to the same extent, and you don't have prejudice to the same extent. One of the characters that stands out to me or the two characters, in fact, that stand out to me when thinking about this in regards to Deep Space Nine, is you've got Jake Sisko, the commander's son, and then you've got his friend, whose name escapes me at the moment, who's Rom, the bartender's brother's son. And those two, you know, the Ferengi from the greedy, like, business, trade-oriented background, ends up moving beyond that and joining Starfleet because he, after living on the station with all of these Starfleet officers and all of these other people going along, he wants to ascribe to those ideals. He wants to go and do that thing. Jake Sisko, the son of the commander, has seen some of the other sides of it. And he goes, do you know what? I kind of do, but at the same time, that would more just be to make my dad proud. What I actually want to do is seek truth, and in a reporter kind of journalistic fashion. And so he goes on to do that instead. And it allows for there are still family pressures and other conversations around that, because there are always going to be those things, because those are apolitical and they're not based on anything else other than just one person thinking something good for you and you may be disagreeing. And yet that is still highlighted and shown off and developed and demonstrated, and that's again something that really stands out. Then you've got Voyager, and Voyager was one of the more interesting kind of shows in terms of its premise, where you've got a crew of principal Starfleet officers literally dropped in the deep end, no connection to home, no backup, no nothing, and they have to get back to that place. That's an interesting thing. Now, the way that started out was, they were going to be like, yes, we are Starfleet, yes, there are mitigating circumstances, but we're still going to try and be Starfleet. We're still going to be a representation of the people that we come from, and the place that we come from, and the ship that we're flying, and everything else. We're going to work with that. And for a while, that goes pretty well, but obviously over time, and especially considering that there were disagreements behind the scenes on the show, and there were writing disagreements, and there were other things like that, things kind of went up and down in the later seasons, where things got a bit daft. Not so daft that it made it unwatchable, or that it didn't follow on from stuff that came before, or whatever else, but certain characters kind of got marginalised, where before they had quite a prominent set of roles, and more episodes per season focused on them, and all that kind of thing. But they kind of brushed a couple off to one side here and there, and trying to force other characters together just so they could encapsulate them as like, this is one thing that we're going to show off. And it was a kind of a bit of a mess towards the end, I'll give it that. But overall, again, it highlighted the principles of Starfleet that were so postmodern to the extent that they weren't ridiculous. They were reasoned, they were sensible, they were straightforward, they were functional. And so it made a difference out the other end when humanity and the organisations that they were working with moved beyond Earth into the stars to go and see what was out there. And having all of those tested in the most harsh way by literally picking someone up and dropping them into the deep end was a really great premise, even if it didn't always pan out properly. You know, there are many people. I'm kind of maybe. But there are many people that literally point at Captain Janeway in that show and go, she is literally a fucking war criminal. And then in the later movies involving the Enterprise E with the Next Generation crew, she turns up as an admiral. She's been made an admiral since after Voyager gets back home, and it's like, so she got really? Did they review the various logs and things from Voyager with all the shit she did? But you know, that's neither here nor there overall, because someone who's made that voyage all the way back, gained all of this tech, all of this knowledge, all of this new stuff, and then comes back in one piece and has the legitimate argument of, we tried to do as best we could, but we had to do what we needed to survive. I can believe that they would still be offered essentially a promotion. I can that makes sense to me, you know. And then we get on to the more recent shows. Now, Enterprise, I like Scott Bakula. I watched him in Quantum Leap and stuff like that. And I liked the premise where it was, yes, we're going to do one of the very first experimental series kind of Starfleet ships with a full crew. We're going to do the first Enterprise. We're going to do the precursor to all of this. And we're going to run with it. Stuff early on was a bit iffy to me, because they had some parts in there that were just a bit too odd, too out there, because they didn't want to step on the toes. You know, they were worried about actually stepping on the toes of the original series, you know, and doing things that were a bit too kind of infringing on stuff that had already been established. And so, it took a while for the show to sort itself out. But after a time, they're explaining what happened to the Klingons between them having no head crest in Star Trek, the original series, and then having them again as of the Next Generation onwards. It's they did the connection and the explaining between Worf's explanations and between the explanations of characters like Julian Bashir in time travel episodes in Deep Space Nine. They put in some connective tissue so that it explains some stuff that had been kind of up in the air for a long time. And whilst I would personally say that there were elements, especially in the earlier seasons of, especially in the first season, really, of Star Trek Enterprise, that stood out to me as just good sci-fi, but not good Star Trek. It grew into it over time, and that's fine because they were worried about tackling those things that would cross over so much. There have been a few times when they've been like, yeah, well, we were doing this prequel, and that hadn't been done in Star Trek before because we were always following the flow that Gene Roddenberry had thrown out. You went from the original series, which then chronologically led on to the Next Generation, which kind of led on to and overlapped with the Deep Space Nine, and then which also led on to and overlapped with Voyager. And then after that, you had the last 3 movies that were with the Next Generation cast. You had that run on, and as a result, when Enterprise came onto the scene, there hadn't been it'd been a fair number of years since the last Star Trek, and they were like, we don't know what to do, so they went a prequel. Because for those of you that don't know, the story kind of continued for the main Prime timeline into Star Trek Online and various other associated media. And so as a result, there's stuff there that stands out and is quite prominent from that entire set of things that got continued. And as a result, I don't know if that is part of the reasoning why CBS and kind of the guys that have been making these Star Trek shows have veered away from that, because there is this potential established storyline that has even been bought into by the new J.J. Abrams films, with Spock jumping through the singularity in a black hole to jump timelines, and having I can't remember the name of the ship, Nero's ship, the Romulan mining craft, come through as well, after the destruction of Romulus, after Romulus just blows up. And it gets taken out by a supernova, I believe. But again, it's a case of, like, all of those things have been kind of pulled into whichever timeline and whichever canon you're looking at. It's there, so there is that continuity. But guess what? There's still there's such a vast like setting that there's still more you can do with it. And now this is where we get to Star Trek Discovery. And I know I've taken about 23 minutes or so now just running through the prior seasons. And I wanted to do that for a couple of things. First off, we talked about legacy in regards to Star Wars The Last Jedi, and how honouring legacy is important, because the people that have been continuing to press that thing into success, provide money for it, ask for more seasons of it, give more opportunities to it, those people aren't the people that are just randomly turning up and going, oh wow, yeah, this is great. They're the people that have been there for the last, in my case, nearly 20 odd, over 20 years. In the case of people, some of the people I've talked to, you're looking at all the way back into the very beginning of Star Trek, the very first pilot episode that was thrown up on TV. And so as a result, these people have been giving to this for a very long time. Like, Star Trek and Star Trek conventions are infamous. Things like the Klingon language having full translations of plays like Hamlet are kind of out there in the world, and they're things that people kind of join in on. It's a huge thing that has grown arguably in some instances, because of the realism of it in various places, it is far more solid for its fan base than something like Star Wars, because obviously you've got a lot of people who want to ascribe themselves to Jediism, for instance, or who have joined collectives to engage in lightsaber training and all that kind of thing. But there's a difference. Firstly, you don't have a real lightsaber. Secondly, you can't use the Force. And so when it then comes to Star Trek, and it's like, well, the Federation, the languages that have been generated for the shows, the discussions around things, the discussions around technology and all that kind of thing, all of those things are fairly solid. You know, flip phones were a thing not so long ago. My own phone now, smartphone, has, you know, many of the capabilities that various tricorders and pads in the shows do, in the later shows do. You know, it all kind of adds up and stands out. And so then when we get to Star Trek Discovery, we have firstly a fairly ignorant attachment to the show anyway, to the overarching Star Trek thing. From some of the changes they've made, some of the things that they've done, and then we've just got the poor structure, the poor character development, and then we've got the whole arc. So we'll go through it in that order. In which case, again, last chance, if you're worried about spoilers, you've already had 25 minutes of this. If you really just wanted to hang on and just see how bad the spoilers are going to be, now they're going to be pretty bad, so piss off. Otherwise, if you're happy and you've seen the shows, or if you don't care about spoilers, stick around and let's get into it. So the first thing I want to talk about is stuff like aesthetics, because we know what various ships look like. Yeah, we know what the various alien races look like. We have had, at the very least, even if we're not counting the original series due to the very different access to special effects and things like that, you've still got The Next Generation, you've got Deep Space Nine, you've got Star Trek Voyager, and then to an extent you've got Star Trek Enterprise, all showing us things like what Klingons look like. The original series, as well as various time travel episodes and other episodes throughout the whole thing, show us what Klingon ships look like. We know full well what various other bits of equipment and uniform look like, both historically as well as in the time period that those shows are from. Certain characters, for instance, Sarek, has been in numerous shows, and we know so much about him and his son Spock, as well as his other son Cybok, who was in one of the movies. We know so much about him, his family, the people that he engaged with. We even know that his childhood pet and its name from an episode where he's dying in The Next Generation, I believe. And so we have this big build-up on this one specific character, and as well as his lineage. And yet, then, randomly, Star Trek Discovery has decided to change what Klingons look like. And that's not even taking into account how badly they represent the culture, how daft and ridiculous some of the jumps they make are, how poorly some of the tech is thought out, how the big MacGuffin of the spore drive is so bizarrely ridiculous that it's just offensive, and the fact that it exists in this prequel series before everything else is just so ridiculous on so many levels, considering that if they had this tech, considering how potent this transportation tech is, if they had this tech so far in advance of everything else that's gone on in the Star Trek universe, the Federation would be just untouchable, plainly. So it's a complete eye roller that this has actually even been included. You know, the mycelial network doesn't make any sense. But more prominently, they decided to make this less of an ensemble cast and more of a main character with a couple of supporting characters. In most other shows, we knew a good handful of the bridge crew. We knew their name, we knew what they were like, we knew what they did, we knew how they spent their spare time, we knew who their friends were, who their rivals were, what they liked, what they didn't like. I think I might have already said that, but we knew that. taking the Next Generation as well as the kind of modern template for the show, that everything else kind of followed on afterwards. We knew the captain, Jean-Luc Picard. We knew his second in command, Commander Riker. We knew the equivalent of the ship's chaplain, which was the counselor, which was Deanna Troi. We knew that her and Riker were kind of a thing, on and off again thing, throughout most of the show. We knew the various tactical officers, both Mr. Worf and Natasha Yar. We got to know the ship's doctor, in terms of, I can't remember the first doctor's name off the top of my head, but then you had Dr. Crusher throughout the majority. You had the technical crew in terms of Lieutenant Commander Data and Chief Engineer Geordie LaForge. And then on top of that, you also had the Transporter Chief O'Brien, who then ends up showing up as a more prominent character in Deep Space Nine. And then you had a couple of other random characters as well. Like you had Wesley Crusher, Will Wheaton, who was the Doctor's son. You had Reginald Barclay, who was some incredibly anxious, holodeck-addicted engineer who just turned up periodically. And then you had a Bajoran tactical officer of some description, whose name escapes me as well, who had a bit of a thing with Riker. And so you had this whole group that you got to know purely from the Starfleet crew. And then you also had Whoopi Goldberg's Guinan, who was there as kind of a times kind of moral compass for various things throughout the show, as well as kind of a just wise bartender just for the fun of it. And you had all of these characters that we got to know, and you had all of these characters that had their own episodes per season. Look, we're entirely focused on those individuals, and it's a case of, right, so there was growth. Jumping straight across to Star Trek Discovery, ignoring how poor the main character is for the first part, how many members of the crew do we actually know on the bridge? Some of them called by name a handful of times. I believe one of them is Ensign Reese. Yeah, and then you've got the helmswoman, who is Dipper, I think. But then we've got the cyborg girlie at the back, who shouldn't be an android, but should be some kind of semi-tech life form. And she's called by name, I think, twice. And we know nothing about her. We've got then we've got the actual helmsman, who's a black woman whose name escapes me, because I think she's referred to by it all of once. Then we get to know Captain Lorca. We get to know the Commander Saru. We get to know the engineer, and we get to know this random cadet who's turned up as well. But all of them are purely supporting characters. None of them get any of their own real individual growth. All of them are reliant on the actions of Michael Burnham, this main character. Now, this is where I'm probably going to piss some people off. I don't care. What it comes down to is she is a terrible fucking character. She is firstly a Mary Sue. She by that I mean she comes in, every mistake she makes gets invalidated. Everything that she does is amazing. She is a specialist at everything, even though her field of expertise is actually very small and is described as such a couple of different times. But she's still more than capable of doing everything. Even when she makes a mistake, other people end up coming round to her side and just backing her up, saying, "You're wonderful, it's fine." And then, as said, everything else revolves around her. There were a couple of episodes where I thought, oh wow, great, we're finally getting an episode about another character, one of those other characters that have been supporting so far that we want to know more about, that are really interesting characters, far more interesting than this one character who shouldn't be here. And then halfway, like a third, 2/3 of the way through the episode at most, you have Michael Burnham swooping in and taking over the entire fucking episode's ending. The entire conclusion is balanced on her as a fulcrum, which makes, that's firstly against the format that the show has been in for so long, and secondly, why should I buy into this show when it's about one character who has no real essence to her, is unable to make mistakes, is incredibly unprofessional, makes some really stupid decisions, is seemingly completely incapable of controlling herself. And one of the things that has been praised time and time again that really annoys me is people going, oh, well, she's the first black female captain, this, that, and the other. Firstly, she's not captain. Secondly, the first female black captain that we see on screen in Star Trek for any like pointed length of time as like a plot point, I believe, is in The Wrath of Khan, where she's the captain on the first ship to encounter Khan, and he just blows it the fuck up because he's Khan. And so, it's a case of there have been those characters all along. You all of these people who have been shouting and screaming about how great this show is just because of that, obviously never watched anything, considering that we've already had a female captain, a black captain. And even though the people that play those characters, Avery Brooks, for instance, always springs out to me as the first like long-running black captain for the show, as like a pivotal kind of plot-focused character. Even he turns around and he goes, well, I was just playing the captain. It didn't matter what colour I was just there to be the captain, because in the Federation at that point in time, it doesn't matter. Is it an interesting reflection on the day, on the modern time that it was filmed in and all that kind of thing? Sure, but that's not what was in the show. We were there to portray what was in the story, not what was going on in the real world, even if there are things that resonate between the two. This is where I get pissed off with what's happened with Star Trek Discovery, because they seem to have completely forgotten that, or just not paid attention to it at all. As said, this seems to be a very ignorant kind of spin on this. And so then we kind of see this kind of detachment, not only from the aesthetic of the show, from the format and the storytelling elements of the show, from certain elements of the history of the show, and just the sense that went into making the previous shows. Excuse me. But we also see this detachment from the core values of the show. Star Trek was one of had a set of core values around this postmodernist future, where we had moved beyond a lot of our petty differences, where we were there to explore and create and learn and develop. We were not there to impose, fight, cause conflict, and so on and so forth. Which is where there are a few things that come into my mind when saying that, because I always remember that one of the reasons why Will Wheaton as Wesley Crusher was in the earlier seasons of Star Trek The Next Generation was because they had the kind of very kind of 80s-ish kind of moral in the story, where you would have people explaining to Wesley Crusher why certain things were like that. And as a result, it was the whole kind of moral of the story part of the show. The same thing you would get from kind of Saturday morning kids TV shows as well. I mean, this went away to an extent after a while because they kind of gauged their audience. But especially early on, this would be a thing. I always remember one episode where I think it's the episode actually that Natasha Yar bites it. But her, Data, and I think Worf as well, possibly, are all clustered around Will on the bridge, and he's asking some questions, and they're explaining it to him. This is the moral of what's going on. This is the meaning behind it. This is how it works. This is how to be good. And that was all stuff that's kind of panned out. Again, even in Deep Space Nine, where you were actually observing the war between the Dominion and the Federation through the Bajoran wormhole, even there, a lot of it is about preservation of life. It's about finding other ways that don't just resort to direct conflict all the time, unless pushed. You've got this rolling theme of always looking for the other way, always trying to grow beyond, always trying to find other things and work with that. And that's something that rolls and rolls and keeps going all the way through. And yet, then you look at Star Trek Discovery, and it's purely wartime, and the Federation are made out to be these poor victims of this group of Klingons that are nowhere near anything like the Klingons that we have seen in any other show. And this is again, they don't look the same, but also they don't seem to work on the same principles as a culture. And they seem to be much more in the way of kind of the space alien equivalent of a white supremacist, or an aggressive Islamist, than they are kind of the Klingons that we've known up until this point. And even from before anything else was created, with like the Next Generation, or not the Next Generation, sorry, the original series, or with Enterprise, which was the prequel, the Klingons in that are still very much the Klingons that we know and remember from other shows, at least to a greater extent, whilst here they're unrecognisable. In which case, that's how it's detaching itself from the legacy of the show whilst wanting to be included on it. And good God, it's done an appalling job. Now, what was the next thing I wanted to say? I said that we would take a look at the aesthetics and the legacy, and we would look at the conclusions and things at the end. But there was something else I wanted to say. It's gone out of my head. I probably should have wrote it down beforehand. But let's get on to the conclusions then. It'll come back to me. So with the conclusions, though, the thing that bugs me about the show is that you have this kind of masturbatory fan fiction that's been developed around this individual character. And it goes through this really wide, ridiculous arc involving episodes around stuff that were usually relegated to 1 or 2 episodes for an entire season of 24 or so episodes for most other shows in the Star Trek kind of franchise. And yet here it's dedicated to, I think, 4 episodes. It goes on forever, and that's the Mirror Universe stuff. And even the Mirror Universe stuff seems to be completely detached from a whole load of stuff that we've seen so far otherwise, you know, from the various other shows where the Mirror Universe has come into play. The Mirror Universe here seems to be pretty far removed in various ways, and it's like I was watching it and I was just getting less interested and more frustrated. But then we get to the end, and this is the last episode, the episode that I watched this morning. Good God, why? Firstly, everything goes gets just nullified out. Everything just gets blurred away. And so you've got all of the consequences of the war, all the consequences of certain characters doing certain things. Gone. Doesn't matter. Those characters are now removed. They've all been wiped away. Everything's just reset. And then you get to the very end, and you've got Michael Burnham, who is a convicted convict pushed into special service, who has now not only been reinstated, okay, fair enough, potentially she's served well enough to do that, but then also she's allowed to make a speech in front of everyone. Why? She's by no means in a position to do so. She gets it's not just that she's earned her way back. She's awarded a medal along with the rest of her crew who actually did their damn jobs all the way through. And then on top of that, it's just invalidated everything. Every concern she had, everything that was done that she ruined, that has just been ignored now. Everything else that has just kind of followed on. Her continual, thanks to being in the center. This is the thing. If you had more variety between the different characters, focusing on different characters for different parts of the show, and it wasn't just all around her few mistakes then, because she wouldn't have as much of an opportunity to make more mistakes and mess up more things, wouldn't be as much of an issue. But she does, and she does so consistently all the way through the show. She makes daft decisions. She acts on emotion over logic, even though apparently she was raised as a Vulcan. And she goes through it. And so now, looking at it, at the end of the show, you've got nothing. Everything's reset to default. Nothing matters from the last 15 episodes that we've watched, ladies and gentlemen. And then, at the very, very end, they're taking Sarek back to Vulcan. And they get a distress signal. and it teases and teases and masturbates and masturbates and masturbates, jacking off all over us, as it basically says, yes, this is the Enterprise coming. And of course, Michael Burnham is Sarek's adopted child that we've never fucking heard of, and who shouldn't be there, and who then comes to a point of, oh, well, Spock's on that ship, shit. And you have the Enterprise literally just roll up at the very end. And it's like, why? What was the point in doing that? In fact, let's get on to Michael Burnham again for a second, actually, because there's something that stood out to me after watching this episode. So let's say that you wanted to have a set of connected characters on the bridge of the Discovery. You know, just why not? It's always nice to have, again, some kind of connectivity and legacy between the different ships. In which case, why Spock? We know everything about Spock. We know everything that happened afterwards. Yeah? We know his entire life. We know his father's entire life. You know, we know all of that. Why randomly try and interject something for the sake of doing it? It makes no sense. It invalidates stuff that's been before or that is supposed to come after. And so, why? If you wanted a arguable person of colour, because I don't think that's a particularly important thing overall, but if you wanted a person of colour of some description who was able to come on board and kind of stand out as a different character with a Vulcan human background and whatever else, then fine, you've got two characters from Enterprise who would have come before, whose ancestor could have been there, whose parents still could have been killed on a science station by Klingons, and it all could have worked out fine. And that would have been some descendant of T'Pol and Tucker in some way from Star Trek Enterprise. And so you could have done that. You could have pushed that on further. You could have seen how that could have meshed together or something like that. And yet they didn't. They went for crowbarring in stuff that didn't need to be there, that made no sense, that quite frankly invalidated certain things and caused damage. Now, why do I think that they've done this? Well, I think they've done this because they've gone, oh, Star Trek was always about all of these big ideals, and we're fighting for those today, even though those things have already been established. You know, they're already in legislation, they're already in law, they're often celebrated, it's already a point that's been won. You don't need to argue for those points anymore. But then they make it about kind of an aggressive kind of system of in fact, you've got two collectivist groups. That's the thing that bugs me throughout this version of the show. You've got two collectivist groups. You've got one that's pushed to desperation and then holds to its ideology in spite of the fact that it doesn't really. And then you've got the others who are another collectivist group, who even when they're not being a collectivist group, are being a collectivist group. And they butt heads. And it's like, yeah, so what you've done is turn this into a war between the alt-right and the SJWs, alt-right and regressive left, in the real world, into a Star Trek fan fiction where you've got one overly focused masturbatory character in the centre who can do no wrong, has no consequences for her actions, and has everything that has even gone on through the show invalidated at the end. How is that a good story? It just isn't. And especially it doesn't live up to what came before. It's just, and in terms of the way it's shot, in terms of the way that it's done, they seem to want to make something more akin to the more recent Battlestar Galactica shows, rather than Star Trek. So I'm sat there going, as a sci-fi, what would I give it? Maybe a 6, maybe a 7. Yeah? Because it's not the worst. The dialogue in various places is absolutely appalling. The story, as said, doesn't have a great flow to it, and it's got this kind of weird disconnect between what the characters do and then what happens before and afterwards. You know, it all seems to have been patched together really badly. But then you come out the other end of it and go, okay, but it's not just any sci-fi. It's Star Trek. with again this long history behind it, and considering the state of it, the lack of reasonable and logical and sensible connection between it and the previous franchise shows, it's a poor show. In fact, it is the worst Star Trek, hands down, in terms of writing, in terms of story, and this is compared to the original series with like Shatner's overaction and a drunk Scottish engineer and all that stuff. You know, you hands down, this is worse because there's a distinct lack of consistency. There's a distinct lack of buy-in, and it wants to make it about stuff that the show was never about. It wants to highlight all of these things, and again, one of the things that stands out to me is that all of these people celebrating the fact that the main character, when there shouldn't be a main character, is a woman of colour, and it's like, right, okay, even though that's not necessarily a big thing in the show, they've been around for a while in various capacities, you know, on and off, and then them going, oh, well, it's never been in there before, you know, it's not been there before. It's like, yes, it has. It's like some of the cast of Rogue One turning around and going, well, Star Wars has never had this kind of diversity in its cast. Really? Have you watched the first movies? You've got aliens, you've got people of colour, you've got people who are just people, and that's the whole point. They don't have that issue in that fictional universe, and they have moved beyond it in some way, shape or form for you to look at it and examine it in a different way. In which case, this is the problem that I have with all of this creativity by committee. It either just ruins something entirely because it's overly corporate, or it takes it off on a spin that goes in such an odd direction and makes it so much more kind of tied into reality and what people are talking about, and how we're going to be attracting the edgy vocal teens of the world who think they know best when they have no fucking clue. You know, all of those kind of things. They want to pull it all together and go, that's what we're going to do. We're going to attract Logan Paul fans. We're going to attract SJWs. We want to pass it by Anita Sarkeesian so that she gives it a thumbs up. And it doesn't matter if it's worse. It doesn't matter if it's a poor story, if it doesn't connect with the rest of the franchise, if it devalues and irritates the connection that fans for the last 40 years or so have had to the franchise. You know, all of that doesn't matter. We're going to do it this way. And it annoys me. It really, really frustrates me because you see it in so many different places, which is why I've done these videos. And it's a case of going, yeah, but by doing it, by bringing it closer to reality, or like your perceived reality, I should point out as well, by doing that, or by highlighting that certain things don't, you know, line up more with your ideology in writing it rather than the way that they have been all along, then you water it down. And there's nothing special about it anymore. All the interesting things get pulled out. You know, if you have distinct races with distinct specialities, and then you just water it down to, oh yeah, but all of those things are kind of cosmetic. This race doesn't actually have this thing because we didn't want to portray men and women as different, or we didn't want this to happen. You know, we didn't want this species who historically has had a racial divide of some description. We didn't want that to be a thing. You know, like the Romulans and Remans, for instance. If that was a thing that came to pass, then, well, guess what? You've just watered it down to the extent that interesting subplot, that interesting set of things, no longer exists. You've just removed a draw to your story, and it's a waste of all the money and all the time you put into it, because the people you should be trying to engage with, the people that have allowed this franchise or other franchises to grow over however long these franchises have been around for, well, you've just driven them all away. You've just taken away the things that were special to them that they wanted to engage with. Anyway, guys, I'm realised that this is pushing an hour now, so I'm going to call it quits there. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I realise that there are going to be a lot of people that were like, no, I loved it. But then again, I ask you, did you like it because it was just a sci-fi show that just matched up with you? Or is it something that you are actually invested in because it's Star Trek and just because it's got the name? Or are you sat there looking at it going, how well does this add up with everything? If you feel it adds up with everything from previous shows, from other things that you've loved about them, please drop me a comment down below and we can discuss. Because quite frankly, after, as said, 20 odd years of me binge watching the shows now that as well that they're on, that they're online, and taking time to actually, when I missed 2 seasons of Voyager at one point because I was working, I was like, I want to watch those, and I sat down, found them, and watched them. When I've invested in the franchise as a whole for so long, and where I did try to find my Star Trek encyclopedia that I've got kicking around somewhere because I'm that kind of nerd, and I was just like, I wanted to go through it. I wanted to actually highlight some other bits and pieces. Maybe I'll still do that in another video. If you'd like to see me pick Star Trek Discovery to pieces some more, then let me know. I'll gladly try and dig around, find it, and do so. Because as said, I don't feel this show does a good job by any stretch. And so what I am hoping above all else, which I know won't happen, but I am hoping above all else, is that they basically go, Star Trek Discovery, 1 season, 1 and done. Cool. Now we'll move on to something else that's more sustainable, that has more sense to it, that is more of what the fans have asked for, which is more of what people are interested in from the show. There's so much that can be done with it. Give us that. Take us forward, instead of having to try and go back and rely on nostalgia for money's sake, and leave people who are ignorant of the show and are not invested in it to go and create fan fiction for it, because that's all this show was. But anyway, as said, I'd love to hear your thoughts, guys, so that we can discuss. As I might have pointed out, this kind of means a lot to me in terms of a franchise that I bought into, and the fact that it is one of these franchises that has been transformative for people. There are very few people on Earth who don't know who Kirk and Spock are, and same for who that Patrick Stewart played Jean-Luc Picard and all that kind of thing. There are very few people that aren't at least somewhere aware of that. So anyway, as said, it's a big deal for various reasons, and it's a bigger deal for me because I actually bought into it and I liked it, and it was something that informed my thinking and my scientific view on the world as I progressed. It was a case of fiction informing my thinking that allowed me to then express that in the real world, go back and appreciate the fiction in a more holistic way, I suppose. But anyway, thank you very much for watching, guys. I'll see you in the video tomorrow. Take care. Thank you very much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video, then please drop us a like, share this video, and subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the video tomorrow. Take care.